Alright, I'm going to show you guys how to create a basic game in GameBuilder Studio. So let me show you what we're going to be creating. I'm going to open up my project that I've already created. I'm just going to launch this. Alright, pretty cool. So let me show you how to create this. I'm going to start with a new project. And I'm going to bring in my scrollable background. I'm going to use this predefined quick object here on the toolbar. I'm going to bring in my galaxy background. And I'm also going to bring another layer for the background that I'm going to add here in a second. The green stars. And all I have to do is select from the drop down that background. Set the registration point to 0, 0 because I want it to be at the top left corner of the image. Then I'm going to jump to the spatial. The spatial controls the position and the size of renderers. And every entity has a spatial and a renderer in GameBuilder Studio. So I'm going to put this to at 0, 0. And I'm going to increase the size to be the width of the stage, 800 by 600. And I'm going to add another one. I already imported the image. I'm going to look for the green dots there, set the registration point to 0. And then I'm going to hop to the spatial, and in the next update you'll be able to just change the properties here because this allows you to tell GameBuilder Studio which spatial controls this render. But for right now, you got to hop over to the spatial and change this. So I'm going to put it at 0, 0, and I want it to be 800 by 600. Now I need to set a scroll value on the top layer to -90. I want it to go up, scroll up in the Y direction. The x-axis is from left to right. The Y is from top to bottom. And I'm going to go to the galaxy background and set the scroll to a separate speed, a different speed, -150, and it'll give it a parallax effect to give it some depth. Now I'm going to lock these two layers. I'm going to call this one Galaxy, and the other one Galaxy Green Stars. Now I'm going to add some object tags that I'm going to use for collision detection later on. So asteroids, missiles, and gunship. Alright, now let me bring in my gunship. And I'm going to bring in the fireball. Now I could have this fireball on a and the ship on a sprite sheet, but I have them separate because I'm going to show you how you can hook up two different sprites on one entity. So let me just drop, using a quick object, drop a sprite in here, a basic sprite. And I'm going to go to the renderer and select the gunship. And this gray box here is the collision shape. The ship's not going to be colliding with anything, so let's just reduce the let's jump to the spatial and reduce the collision shape. We're just going to make it small, and we're going to make it kinematic because kinematic objects are not affected by the force in the physics engine in the game. But it allows you to still move this object. And we're going to set the object type to gunship and collides with gunship because we don't want it colliding with anything else. If you leave that empty or unselected, it'll collide with everything. Now let's scale this down a bit. You can now just scale down objects and move them in the scene in GameBuilder Studio, which is a lot nicer. It's about right. And I'm going to center this by jumping to the render and changing the registration point. I want to, oh, a little too much. I want to push it over to the left. So there we go. The registration point is inverted, so if you put a positive value, it'll push it to the left. And I'm going to put this at, say, 130, or I want to get it down to the bottom. There we go. Alright, now let me drop in another renderer. So I'm going to add a component. I'm going to add a renderer component for the fireball. I'm going to call it fireball renderer. To display a sprite sheet in GameBuilder Studio, you need two components, a sprite sheet renderer and a sprite sheet component that'll hold the individual frames. So let me add the sprite sheet component. And I'm going to look for sprite sheet component. And let me jump to the fireball sprite sheet component and bring in the engine fire sprite sheet. And I'm going to tell this I want it to divide this sprite sheet up by the cell count, because it's individual frames in a sprite sheet is a cell. And I know that it has 8 frames across in one row in the y-axis. And in order for that to display on the stage or in the game, I have to assign a sprite sheet to the sprite sheet renderer. And voila, there you go, and you can scrub this scroll bar here, or this slider, and you can see the frames. Now I want to scale it down a bit because it's taking the size from the ship. I want this thing to be scaled down, so let's see. I'm going to decrease the scale on the renderer because renderers control scale. And scale is different from size. The size is like the original size of the asset, and the scale will allow you to kind of stretch and squash it. Now I'm going to offset this using the position offset, because it's sharing the position from the ship. So as you move this, it moves with the ship. So I want the offset to be negative and a negative value. I'm going to put this at 50. That's about right. And negative, that's too much. I'm going to nudge it a little bit more. And I'm just doing this trial and error. Now I want the fireball to show up below the ship, so I'm going to look at the Z index. It's 3 here, so I'm going to jump to the ship render and bump the Z index up so that it's above it. Now let me add some logic to this. And the way I'm going to add logic is I'm going to use a rules component. Now I'm going to use a naming convention like this, logic underscore move left, and I'm going to add a rule component. And in this rule component I have different conditions that I can add, and I'm going to say when the user, or when the keyboard input is left, which is the left arrow, when that's down, I want this thing to move or fire a move action, and that move action is going to control the spatial. So let me just label this here, move left, and I wanted to go to the left of the screen, so I'm going to put 180 as the angle that I want it to go, and the speed will be 300. And I'm going to add another one, another rule component called logic move right, because I wanted to move right. I'm going to do the same thing, add a keyboard when it's right. When the keyboard input is right and that's down, move this object to the right. And I'm going to tell it to control all the spatials, and 0 is going to move it to the right, 90 would move it up the screen, 180 is left, 270 is below. I'll probably add a dial here for you to be able to just spin so that you don't have to remember the angles. The speed, will just put it at 300. Now I didn't say much about this right here. This little icon is an expression icon. So what I could do is I can put an expression in here to point to another component that I can add on here so that this value can be driven by something else. So let's do, and the syntax is self, which means I'm referring to the entity here, dot, let's call it ship values dot speed. And let me copy that and put that on the move left. And I'm going to add a component in here called ship values, and it's going to be a data storage component. That's how I can store properties, custom properties on entities in the game. Now where is that? There we go. And I'm going to add an integer property called speed. I'm going to set it to 300. Now I'm also going to need a scorekeeper in here because I'm going to add a score label up at the top. So I'm just going to do that ahead of time. Scorekeeper. And it's going to be a data storage component as well. I could have added it to the same ship values, but just to keep things separate. I'm going to call this score, and I want that to be 0. Alright, so now let's see what else we have to do here. We got to create the missile. So let me drop in another sprite, and I'm going to bring in my missile. A missile graphic. Or what I could have done, so I'm going to delete this. Could have just done this, drag it over, and it wires it up for you with the required render and spatial. And let's see, I'm going to scale this down slightly, just a little bit. And I'm going to adjust the collision shape on it so it's form-fitting. So I'm going to jump to the spatial, and I can just draw a collision shape over it. There we go. And I want this thing not to be able to be rotated, so I'm going to change that. I want it to be kinematic because I don't want it to be pushed down by gravity. So I'm just going to set that to kinematic, and I want it to collide, continuously collide like a bullet, and turn off sleeping. Sleeping would allow a object to fall asleep during simulation if it's not being simulated to save on performance, but we don't want that with this. So the object type is a missile, and it collides with an asteroid. So let's put that filter on there, and let's add some logic to this missile. So we want to give it a lifespan, right? We don't want the bullet to just go off into infinity. So let's say logic lifespan, and that'll be a rule that says after, I'm going to put a timer. So after 2 seconds, let's say, set that to run to completion so it doesn't get interrupted. I want this thing to destroy this bullet entity or this missile entity. And I'm just going to label it destroy timer, just so I know what that is. And I'm going to add another logic component to handle collision. And it'll be a rule component. Now I want this thing to have a condition that says when the entity receives not a mouse event but a collision event, when that started with an asteroid, I want this thing to trigger some actions here. Now one of the actions I wanted to trigger is to increment that score value I had on the ship. So let's use a change property. We're going to call it increment score, And we're going to use a property reference. This little symbol here, the target icon, symbolizes a property reference. So that means you can reference other entities and properties on other components using this syntax. Because it's another entity that we're going to reference, I'm going to use a £, then the name of the entity, gunship dot score. Keeper was the name of the component we created, and the value is score. So I wanted to increment that value, and now to dynamically increment this value, we're going to need to use a expression. So we're going to switch this to expression, and we're going to have to call now you see the little expression icon. We're going to have to call the get entity method on inside this expression. And we're just going to pass the name of the entity that we're looking for, gunship. I'm going to put quotes around it, dot, and then the name of the scorekeeper component, dot score. So it's just slightly different for the expression. You have a get entity and then pass the name for the expression. And over here you just put a £, for property references, a £, then the name of the entity, then the component. Save that. Now, what else do we have to do here? We need to destroy this thing if it collides. So we're going to just put a destroy action on that. So our missile is pretty much done. Now that just went off stage. I can toggle this view frustum so I can see what's outside of my stage, and I can also toggle the shape, collision shape but setting right there so that I can hide those shapes. Now I'm going to put a spawner on this ship because I want this ship to be responsible for spawning the missile. So let me add another component to this and call it spawner. Call it missile spawner. And it will be a rule component. And I want this rule to have a condition that responds to a keyboard event of the spacebar. And I wanted to spawn an entity, so we're going to look for that action. Open that up. I wanted to spawn, you know what I didn't do? I didn't label my missile. So it's very important to label your entities and call this gunship missile. And this one is gunship. Because if you don't label these, then it's gonna be hard to know what to reference. So go back to this action. I'm going to call this spawn missile. And now I can see I want to spawn the gunship missile, and I want to spawn it relative to this entity, which is the ship that I'm adding this component to. If I uncheck this, it'll be relevant to the scene and just spawn it out here, starting from the origin. So I want it to spawn from the ship, and the ship's origin is somewhere down here. So I want to push it up in the Y about maybe 140 in the negative direction, so up the screen. I want the angle to be 0 and the position to be 0. Yeah. Now let's see, that should be good to have movement and have a spawning missile. So let's check that out. Oh, I gotta save my project. You gotta make sure to save before you can build, and save often. So let's just call this asteroids. Oh, rather not call it asteroids because I have a project in here already. Let me call this asteroids demo. All right. Now let's launch that. Okay, we have a scrolling background now. And one thing I didn't do is I didn't add a controller to handle this, the fireball, but we do have movement. And let's see, spawning is happening, but it's not, the missile doesn't have logic to move. And you saw that it was dying. So let me add another logic component to this and call it logic move, a rule component. And I want this thing to move up the screen in the Y direction, the Y axis, all of them. And I'm just going to call this move up. And the direction I want it to go in is 90. So up the screen, and I want it to move at a pace of 300. Alright, and then let me add the animation controller to animate this sprite sheet. So I'm going to call it Fireball Controller. And it's going to be a sprite sheet controller that is going to change the sprite index or the frame index rapidly so you can see animation. And this controller looks for a sprite sheet renderer, which we have added already. And we're going to remove this default animation and add a fire animation, which will just be frame 0 to 7. And we'll have it animate 30 frames per second in a loop. And we're going to set the sprite sheet to Fireball sprite sheet. That's the frames that we want it to use from that sprite sheet. Alright, now let's add the asteroid in here. I'm going to drop another, well, I'll just go and import the asteroid and drag and drop it in. Oh, I had the quick object selected, so it added another one. Scale this down slightly, push it off screen here, and I'm going to call this asteroid. Alright, now I want this asteroid to be able to explode, so let me add a couple more components here to animate a sprite sheet. Let's call it explosion. Explosion renderer. And I want a sprite sheet render component. And we're going to add an explosion sprite sheet. There we go. And we're also going to add a controller here because we want something to control the animation. Sprite sheet controller. There we go. Now let me import that explosion sprite sheet. And the sprite sheet is pretty much just frames, on an individual image. So you can see 4 across and 4 top to bottom. So let me select that image. And we want to divide that 4 by 4. Alright, and then we want to add that sprite sheet to this renderer by selecting it from the drop down. This render looks like it's not a sprite sheet render, it's a sprite render. So I added the wrong one. Let me remove this. I want a sprite sheet renderer. Alright, let me select that sprite sheet. And there we go, you can see the frames of animation. So we're going to start it off at frame 15. But let me position it quickly here. And we're going to set the position offset to say -40. Nope, not enough. Alright. And we're going to push it up the screen, so we're going to give it -90. Perfect, right over it. Now we want this alpha to be 0 because we're going to toggle this here in a second. Put this frame back to the start frame. And we're going to jump over to the explosion controller. Explosion controller takes a renderer And we're going to add a couple animations here. The idle animation is just going to sit on the first frame. So we're going to say frame 15 to 15 and set this to default. Now we need to be able to switch this, toggle these animations here. So we're going to have to use a property reference. Now the explode animation needs to go from frame 15 to 0, and we want to speed it up. So we want it to happen over 60 frames. We want it to loop and use that sprite sheet. We're going to use this property reference field here for the current animation to read in a value from another component. So I'm going to create a properties component with an animation property on it. So let me add that. Call it properties. And like we did earlier, that is a data storage component. And we're going to add a property called animation. And it'll be a string, and it'll start with the value of the first animation, which was idle. Alright, so we have our sprite sheets added. We have the controller. Now we need to add some logic to this asteroid. We want this asteroid to destroy itself. We're going to use a logic destroy. We want it to destroy itself over time. So let's say after 30 seconds of it not being collided with, destroy. Well, we could reduce it to say 20 seconds. We want it to run to completion, and we want it to fire the destroy action. Now, if I leave conditions empty if I want this action just to fire without having to be evaluated. Now, I also want to add another component to handle the collision logic. Now, this is where a lot of the logic for controlling the animation is going to go. Alright, so in here, when the object collides, so we want a condition, when it collides with a missile, then we want it to do a number of things in sequence. This action list here runs in sequence. So change the property, the animation property that we set on the properties component. So the syntax is at properties because we're just referencing the component. Animation, we're going to use a string, and we're going to set this to explode. That's the animation I set on the controller. So change animation, and we want this thing to toggle the explosion, so show explosion. And the explosion is the explosion render dot alpha. We're going to toggle the alpha value with an integer. We're going to set it to 1. 1 is visible, 0 is not visible. And we want to hide the asteroid. So we're going to change the property of the asteroid, which is just render. Let's see, hide asteroid, render. And I'm just using the names from these components here. Alpha. And the integer should be 0 because we want to hide that. Now we need a destroy timer on this, but before I do that, let me add a play sound action. Play sound, and we don't have a sound imported yet, so let me import the explode sound, and I'm going to import the epic battle track that we're going to use earlier. I'm sorry, use in a few minutes here. So play explosion. I'm going to label that. I'm going to select the explode. I'm going to add a destroy timer to this. So timer object. And we wanted to give it some time. We want to give this thing some time to play the animation before it gets destroyed. So after 0.5 seconds, we want this thing to destroy itself, this asteroid. Now, what else do we have to add here? I think that's it. So we have logic that'll explode once it gets collided with. It has a lifespan. It has some properties on here to toggle the animation. And that should be it for that. So let's launch that. All right, we got our movement. We got missiles spawning from the ship, and the asteroid's off screen. So let's start spawning this asteroid. We want to add a spawner here. So we're just going to drop in a shape, and drag it off the stage, and we're going to make this, all objects when they're added to the game have a collision spatial that falls with gravity. So unless it has something to fall on, we need to change this to static. And we don't want it to do any of this. We don't want it to move or rotate. And I want this to have a rule, a logic rule on it, spawner. And I want this logic to spawn an asteroid whenever the user or the game player hits the space bar. So we're going to add a spawn entity action. Now we're going to select the asteroid. We want to randomly spawn across the top of the screen. So we're going to do it in the X axis, the X direction. So we're going to use an expression function. So only within the fields with this icon can we use this. And it's called random times 800, the width of the stage. So it'll randomly pick a number between 0 and 100. And we want it to start at -200 above the stage. And we're not going to check relative to entity, otherwise it would end up down here. So that's good. Spawn, call it spawn asteroid. And what we also want to add to this thing is, we want to check the spatial on the asteroid to make sure that we put the filtering. We adjust the collision shape and put the filtering on this to label it as a missile. As an asteroid, and tell it it can collide with missiles. And we don't want it to sleep, and these are fine. And we want dynamic movement because we're just going to let gravity force this object to fall down the screen. Alright, let's add a label to keep track of the score. So we're just going to use a quick object. I clicked the little icon down here, jump to the renderer, and we can add text here. Call it asteroids. And we're going to increase the size. Now, one thing to note is when you take these handles here and scale objects, it actually does a scale and it doesn't adjust the original size. So that's important to understand. So we're going to adjust the size here to 190 so it doesn't cut off the text, and we're going to put the scale back to 1. In a future update, I'll probably add a control where you can hold down control and drag, and it'll just do the sizes instead of the scale. Now I want to adjust, I want to leave that to white, and that looks fine. I'm going to drop another one for the actual score. Now I'm not labeling these, so I need to do that. And changing this label on the layer will actually change the entity's name that you reference. So let's call this asteroid label and score label. the score label is just going to be a number. Let's change the color on this to something else, and that's fine. Now we're going to have to do a little bit of wiring up here. In order for this to be driven, we want to drive this value every time the missile collides with a asteroid. Now, if you remember, we added a property or a component onto the ship that's a scorekeeper, and it has a value called score. So we want to bind using an action. We want to just call this bind score value, and we want to use a constrain property, and we're gonna use the property reference input here to reference the value from the gunship. And remember to reference an entity, another entity outside of the one that you're adding components on. You have to do # gunship dot scorekeeper was the name of the component, score. Well, actually, no, we don't want this here. We want this. We want to get the value from this. So we want to actually set that value to the text property on the renderer. So we're going to say at renderer dot text, because we're referencing the component that's on the same entity, and we're going to use an expression to pull in the value from the gunship. So remember, we had to use get entity, and we have to give it a name. We have to pass in the name of the entity gunship that matches up the entity in the layer panel up here, dot, and I'm just going to paste that scorekeeper dot score. Now you're going to be able to click on these icons in the next update and open up a browser, a property browser and an expression editor, so that it's a lot easier to update these values and to know which properties you can set. So let's just call that constrain score. I'm going to save that. Now I need to increment the score, and I believe, did I add that already? Yes, I did. So I added that functionality already to increment the score, but I didn't add the +1 here because we wanted to increment +1. We're going to take the value of score that's on the gunship, and we're going to increment it +1 and set it back to the same value, so it'll increment itself. And that's going to automatically be read in. So let's launch that and see what we have. There we go. And our score increment. Now let's add the final touches on this and add the epic soundtrack. We just drag and drop the sound file and it'll create an object. We call it background music. And we'll select the epic battle track. You can play it to hear it. And I'm going to select auto start so that when I play it, it'll automatically play. Possibilities here are endless. I mean, we can keep going and polish it up some more, but you get the picture. Give the beta a try, download it. I look forward to you guys' feedback and and adding some more enhancements and improvements to GameBuilder Studio.